Hello everyone, this is Don Lloyd. I'd like to give you a tutorial of the board game Dark Horse, and I'm going to break this down into a couple different sections, but I'm going to start off with basic phases and setup. And unfortunately I think this is going to be a long video, but I'd like to spend some time going into different details, and I will make sure to break off this video into different topics. If you want to go to a specific rule, then you can look up in which section it is. I'm thinking this is going to be about 4 parts to this video. But let's go ahead and first things first, let's talk about the overall objective behind the game and some of the setting of Dark Horse. Now, some people may be thrown off by the name of the game, Dark Horse. Does this mean there's a horse racing game, or what does it have to do with horses? Well, Dark Horse is a term that basically means or characterizes a person that people know very little about, and they're in a competition or a race. And basically they come up from behind and they win the competition, but people didn't really know about them beforehand, what their skills or strengths were or where they came from. And that's the main influence behind the name of the game. The game has you take over the role of a character in the Old West. And by using this character, you basically have certain advantages and sometimes even disadvantages that will be able to be used in the game. And by using these basic skills and abilities, you can play the game differently each time and try to take different tactics and routes to victory. So with that being said, you're all coming to Dark Horse County, and you're in an attempt to influence the most people that you can. You want to build a large territory with multiple towns and cities and rails and connect everything and have this nice network of buildings and towns. And also you want to go up on the influence track in the game, so at the very end of the game the person with the most victory points wins. So how you do that is basically by, like I said before, if you build the largest and best network of rails and towns and cities, that can be a big score for you, but you can also supplement that by the influence track, and influence points transfer directly into victory points. Plus you also get things like victory points for gold that you collect in the game. So there's a couple different ways for you to gain points in the game, and there's also 2 different ways to trigger the game end. The very first one is to hit 11 points on the influence point track, and that'll trigger the end of the game, and then people start scoring. The other one is to build all of your cities and towns. So you have 3 cities and 6 towns, and you start with 1 city and 2 towns. So in reality, you don't have to build very many things onto the board before it triggers the end of the game. But a lot of the scoring is dependent upon if you have the best rail network set up. And I'll describe that a little bit more once I get going in the game setup. So the next thing I want to talk about is the basic phases behind the game itself. There is a placement phase and there is a collection phase. And in the placement phase, you basically just place your dice. So everyone takes their 2 dice and they roll them all at the same time. So everyone has their dice available. It's public information. If you see someone else has, rolled 6 and a 5 and can take the 11 action, then that's public knowledge. Now you'll notice that you have 3 dice. The only time that you can ever roll 3 dice is if you have on the previous turn obtained a bonus die. And that just gives you a little bit of a boost and a way to roll numbers that you couldn't normally get to, like the higher 10s and 11s and 12s. And there also are ways to modify your dice. And once I get into the action section of the game, or I should say the action space section, then I'll go over all the possible ways that you can modify your dice. But back to the placement phase. Everyone rolls 2 dice unless they've obtained a bonus die, and they take turns in turn order, placing on 1 action. And for the most part, you will always just place on 1 action. There is 1 action space that kind of breaks that rule. It's called the dealer action, and it allows you to plus or minus the result on 1 die or multiple dice. and that's the only time you would ever place dice in two different spots. But for the most part, you're taking over one action, and then it goes to the next person in turn order. And then that person has the option to place 1, 2, or 3 dice on an action until everyone has taken their turn and there are no more dice to place. So once you get to that point, you're in the collection phase. And the collection phase is really straightforward. You just pick up your dice off the various actions that you've collected upon. Now, the only restriction to this is that you have to collect your dice in a specific order. Now, you'll notice on the game board that there is the influence track on the left and bottom edge of the game board. And then above the influence track is a jail spot, and then the turn order action. So the turn order action is really the first action that people collect from. And then they go up to the dealer action, and then they would go over to the produce resources action, and then the pioneer action, and so on. And they would go all the way to the right and then down that edge, that far right, and collect all the actions that they have dice on. So that means you have to plan ahead. If you need food or wood for the builder action, then you have to produce them in the produce resources action first, because by the time you get to that action, you don't have a chance to collect anything more. And that'll become more apparent once I actually get into explaining some of these actions. But it takes some planning and resource management, and also rolling dice and then taking the separate actions. But before I get too far ahead of myself, I've described the placement phase and the collection phase. The next thing that I need to talk about is the game setup in general. Now, I've already laid all of the tiles, resource hex tiles, onto the game board. And you'll notice that in the very dead center of the board, I have 4 resource hex tiles revealed, and they're all ore. Now, this is the general basic setup that I like to start, or I should say that's the basic setup that's listed in the rule book. The other thing you need to do is reveal the bottom and top row of resource hex tiles, just so players have a little bit more additional information. Now, once you've done that, the game is basically ready for players to take their turns placing their cities and towns in free rail onto the game board. In reverse turn order, they need to place these down. So the thing that needs to happen first is determine turn order. Now, you can do this any way you want, randomly. You can roll, you can shake up the discs, but however you decide it, you need to put the colored discs onto the turn order track. Now, you notice that on the turn order track it shows a 1, 2, 3, 4, and this basically corresponds to first player, second player, third player, and so on. Another thing you need to do is to place these discs on the gold star at the top of the influence track, and this is basically just to mark how much influence points are being collected in the game. So as you can tell up in the turn order section, the blue player is last. Well, one of the benefits for being last in turn order once the game starts is that you get to place your city first. So like I said, in reverse turn order, the blue player is going to place their city down on the board. Now, I need to describe city placement and town placement a little bit more before I do this. Cities can only go on non-resource hexes. So all of these other hexes on the board that don't show a resource on it or a resource hex tile is where you can place a city. The next thing you'll ask is, well, what does a city do for you? Well, a city gives you access to every resource hex around it. So you'll see that there's a resource hex above the city and 2 revealed resource hexes down below. So this blue city being here allows me to build towns on those resource hexes. So that's where my city goes. The next thing to describe is towns themselves. Towns can only ever go on resource hexes. So you just have to remember, cities can only go on non-resource hexes and towns only go on resource hexes. So in this example, if I were to go ahead and reveal this hidden resource hex, one of the advantages of the game setup is that you ignore the rugged penalties. Now, a rugged penalty on a hex simply means that if you want to build a town there, you have to pay 1 additional ore, and that's basically why it says +1 ore down below there. Normally a town costs 2 food and a wood. Well, once the game starts, if I were to place a town on this, I would have to pay 2 food, a wood, and an ore. But because this is the game setup phase, you ignore that. So I like to have players go ahead and reveal that top hex right away, especially when they're playing in the safe zones. Now I'll step back a few seconds. The safe zones are denoted as each corner of the game board. So where you see these hexes that are already printed on the territory map, these are basically safe zones because at minimum you know you'll have a food and a wood. So the blue player has to place 1 more town, and because they already know that they have a town on a food resource hex above the blue city, they're going to go ahead and place a town on the wood resource hex, just so they have a variety of resources. And that is why the food and wood revealed hexes in the corners, that's why that combination is there. Food is probably the most important resource hex in the beginning of the game, and then you also need wood as well, because food is used for rails and food is used for towns. And then later on in the game, you'll get to build cities, but right away, that's not the thing that you should be concentrating on. So the only other thing we need to place right now is the free rail. And there has been some questions in the past about when can this free rail be placed. And the answer is it has to be placed after you've placed a city and your towns down. So I need to describe how do you place down rails. Well, rails have to come out of a city, or they can be on the end of a rail that you control. So this is my blue city here. I can place a rail leading outside of my city like this or here. I can also place a rail directly on the hex where the city is located. And that's also helpful for scoring a little bit later in the game, and I'll talk about that in just a few seconds. But I recommend for a lot of players just to place their first free rail either pushing out in this direction so players can take over some more territory, or potentially leading up there so you're leading up towards this rugged area. Now you may ask, so you had mentioned that you want to place rails so you can build up into new areas. Well, here's how you do that. If I were to place 1 more rail, or I should say build 1 more rail in the game, once it starts, as soon as I touch that rugged ore hex, then I have access to drop a town there. And this is, of course, all assuming you take the actions and you pay the resources to drop additional rails and towns. But now that I have a rail to this town, or this resource hex, I can build a city there, a town. Now, this wood resource hex down below that, you can tell that there is no connection. And the first city that I placed only gives me access to place around the resource hexes that are directly around the city. So this is why rails are needed. Rails allow you to grow out your territory. So let's go ahead and talk about what you would need to place another city in the game. Now, normally, you'll notice that you have to have a rail touch a resource hex before you can place a town on that resource hex. Now, cities are a little bit different. Cities require that you have a rail placed on one of the hex lines before the city can be built. And this kind of represents additional infrastructure for the train station and the ability for the rails to get into that hex territory. So if I only had 1 rail like so, it would be illegal for me to place a city there because, as I mentioned, you have to have another rail on the hex that surrounds the city. And that's the only requirement. The other thing is that you can't place cities too close to each other. So when the game very first starts out, there is a restriction that cities have to be at least 2 hexes away. So for example, if the purple player wanted to place a city really close to me, the closest they could probably place it is right here, because that would be 1, 2 resource, or I should say hexes away from the blue city. This would be illegal when the game is first started. Now later on in the game, once the game starts, you can place cities 1 hex away. So this would be legal as long as I have the proper rail connections, and that would be legal, and I do have the proper rail connections for my blue city here. So, and that's all reinforced in the rulebook as well. So that's basically how you would place your cities, towns, and rails. Let's talk about scoring a little bit, and this sometimes confuses a lot of players. And I think the easiest way to describe scoring is to show you what perfect scoring would be for, say, 2 cities. So let's pretend it's further on in the game, and I have built these 2 cities, and I have dropped down and built towns on all of the resource hexes around those areas. Now, each city is worth as many points as towns connected to it by rail. So in this example, this city has a connection to this one town, and vice versa, this city also has, by nature of this rail here, a connection to that city as well. So both of my cities are only worth 1 point. Now if I were to start building additional rails, now all of a sudden these 2 cities have 2 connections. And the perfect scoring for these 2 cities would be something along these lines. Now, if we go ahead and look at this very first city, we'll notice that there's a rail touching on this resource hex, and of course this in the top one. So it can trace back a path to all towns. Same thing with the blue city on the far right. It can trace back a path to all of them. Now, if there's ever a break in this line, say for example there was no rail right there, all of a sudden the city on the right can't connect to these 2 cities down at the bottom left. And what you're after for the best scoring possible is to have every city connected to a town by rail. And that's the basic gist behind scoring your cities and creating a good rail network. Now, this can't always happen in a regular game. Sometimes people are going to beat you to the punch, and one of the game-ending conditions, like I'd mentioned before, is to place all of your cities and all of your towns. So one of the things I like to recommend to people is not having their 3rd city be the last piece that they place. Because if you have 3 cities and, if you have 2 cities and 5 towns, then you're going to score at least 10 points. Whereas if you have 3 cities and 5 towns, you're going to score 15 points. And you leave that sixth town as the last piece that you place. Now this isn't always, you can't always do it that way, and sometimes there aren't the proper places on the board to fit all of these different places. I should say pieces. But in my time playing the game and play testing with other players, it always seems like the players leave that 3rd city to be the last thing dropped on the game board. And if it's a race and someone gets that 3rd city, there can be a huge point offset, which can be slowed down a little bit by a player building their 3rd city in advance and then scoring their rail network, so they're not in a 5 or 6 point deficit. So I mentioned that the game can end when you build all your cities and towns. There's also a game end marker that's placed on the 11 on the influence track, and this can be adjusted too. If players find that not many people score a lot of influence points, you can adjust this down. You can make special house rules for quicker games. Maybe say placing 2 cities and only 5 towns will end the game, or making the game end marker for the influence track be a little bit lower. And in the same regard, you can make the game longer if you'd like by not allowing the 3 cities and 6 towns to be a game end condition, and have players race for the influence point game end condition as well. So that is the basics behind the overall game setup. And the only other thing I need to mention is that when you first start the game, you will start with 1 of each resource. So you will get a wood token, an ore token, and a food token, and also a wild die token. And this is in addition to whatever your character happens to start out. There's a start game box in each character. So if there's some additional resources on that character, or say a stock token, you would get that in addition to these items. It's not an or condition. You get all of that plus the character starting bonus. And that's basically it. Let's go ahead and move on to the actions. Now you'll notice that there are pawns in the game. There are some colored pawns, and what they're used for is the Gunslinger 2-player variant. And I've found that if you're not playing that 2-player variant, then these make a lot better marker for the turn order track. But it's whatever you'd like to do. Switch them out at your own discretion. Otherwise, the game itself specifies to use the game discs that are included in each player bag. So back to the influence track. Whenever you gain an influence point, which is going to be marked by a gold star like that, then you will go up in the track. That's all it is. It's just a way to mark things. Now you will notice that the rules state to place the game end marker at the very end of the track on the 11th spot. So you'd place this game end marker on 11, and when a player gets their disc onto that spot or past that spot, then that would trigger the end of the game. Now that doesn't necessarily benefit a player more than it firing off the trigger for the end of the game and then scoring starts. But it is a valid strategy to try to gain a lot of influence points on the influence track and combine that with your scoring on your cities. So I'll go ahead and put that back. So back to the actions. Let's start off with something that's not an action. This jail spot here is basically just a spot to place your dice when you take a jail action. Now in the core game for Dark Horse, you can only go to jail for action cards. So inside this action card deck is going to be various cards that have a jail symbol. It's just a placeholder for your dice. The next box up from the jail spot is going to be your turn order track. So you'll notice that all the player discs have been placed there. This tracks your turn order. So if I slide these discs back a little bit, you'll notice that there is a 1, 2, 3, 4 listed here in the turn order. So the blue discs is the first player, the red disc is the second, and so on. So this is really just a way for you to know who goes next in the turn order to place their dice. Now you'll notice that there is 3+ on the track. So in this example, if the green player was sick of being last, he could place a 3 or higher, hence 3+. He could place a 3 or higher die on this top position. It's important that you mark that the first person in places on the top, and then the second player would place on the next spot down. Because what's going to happen when this action is resolved, the first player in is going to go all the way to the top and bump everybody down. And in this example, the red player placed in this box second, so they're going to go to the second spot. So in essence, you're basically just lining up these dice where these positions are. But like I said, the big benefit is to slide all the way to the top. And another thing I need to describe is there are limited and unlimited actions. You'll notice that the actions have either a steel colored background with a dashed line, or they have a brown background and no dashed outline. An unlimited action can be taken by any number of players. There is no limitation to that. You can only use an action once, which means there's really no benefit for the turn order, which there would be no reason to place 2 dice in there. But I'll explain in the future how you would run some of these actions. So like I said, the silver background is the unlimited and the brown action is the limited, meaning there's some sort of a limitation on how many dice can go there. And for the most part in the game, a lot of the actions are limited, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But once someone places their die there, or dice, then it locks that action down. No one else can take it. So let's go ahead and move on and talk about the dealer action. The dealer says +1 or -1 to one die, or you can take a loan. So the other thing to mention is that there is an icon in the bottom left corner, and it shows some question marks around what would be represented as a die. This just means any die. So I could place a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 there. It doesn't matter what I place there. If I want to use this action, then I place a dice in there. Now what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to plus or minus a die. We'll just talk about that right now. So say for example I roll something like a 10 with 2 5s. What I really wanted to do was take the builder action. I wanted to get a 6. Well, I can place one of these 5s in here, and then I can end up plus or minusing this 5 die right here, so I can turn it into a 6. Now you don't necessarily flip it to the 6, you just leave it like this and then you mark it. So the rulebook states that you would grab a wild die token from the bank and mark it. So I would mark this and put this on the 6 action. And the other option you can take is a loan, the little icon for loan. So here's a loan token, and on the back of every limited token is going to be the instructions for its use. A loan token just basically states that you can take any 3 resources from the bank, but you have to pay back the loan with 6 resources, or you lose a -1 victory point at the end of the game. So like in real life, if you don't pay your loans back, you're in trouble. Another thing to mention is that there is a lightning bolt up in the corner. The dealer action is unique in the fact that whenever you use it, you immediately collect from it. Normally you would place your dice in the placement phase, and then you would move on to the collection phase once all dice have been placed. Well, the dealer action is a little bit different. Once someone puts their die in there, then they instantly collect from that action, which means they instantly plus or minus a die, or they grab a loan token and resolve it right away. And to further illustrate that point, the loan tokens also have a little tiny lightning bolt on the icon, or I should say the token, meaning you have to do it right away. So let's go ahead and move on to the produce resource action, and this is probably the most complicated action in the game, but once you understand how it works, it's pretty straightforward. There's just a lot of icons on this action which can sometimes confuse people. So you've got all these symbols here showing any die. What this basically means is that this section right here, someone can put any die in here, 1 through 6. And then you have other symbols in here. You have 2 little figures or silhouettes with a plus. This means 2 players or more. So in a 2-player or more game, you can use these spots. The 3 silhouettes just simply mean in a 3-player or more game, you can use these spots. So basically, in a 2-player game, these are locked down. You could use these and use the 4 pluses, but you could not use the 3 plus. And basically this just allows you to produce resources. So if I go ahead and drop a city on the board and a couple towns, I will illustrate what I mean by producing resources. So the blue player has 2 towns on food resource hexes and 1 town on a wood resource hex. If the blue player were to place a die in the wood row, then he would produce 1 wood resource token because he has 1 town on wood. So you always produce a resource based upon the towns that you have on the board. So in this example, he would get 1 little wood token. Now, if he were to take another die and place it on the food icon, or I should say the food row, then he would collect 2 different food resource tokens because he has 2 towns on food. So it's pretty straightforward. Now the twist on this is this little 4+ icon. And the 4 plus icon basically means that it's additional effort. Because the dice represent your citizens or your townsfolk that are currently working for you in your various locations or in the territory, the higher a number is, the result is on a die, it means additional effort or more people working for you. So if I were to have a 4 or higher and I were to place that on food, then I would still produce resources off both of my towns on food, but I would produce 1 additional. So in this regard, I would get 2 food plus 1. If I were to do this on the wood row, I would get 1 wood plus 1. So it's always just plus 1. That's the basics behind the produce resource icon, or I should say action. The next action over is the pioneer action. You'll notice that it is an unlimited action. That means any number of players can take this. So if a player puts at least a 1, and here I have to describe that whenever you see a symbol on the board that shows a die with the same number on all sides, this means that you have to have a natural roll to take that. So in this example, I have to have a 1 and then any other die. And don't forget, this takes 2 dice because it shows a picture of 2 dice. So a 1 and any other die, it doesn't really matter what it is, will take the pioneer action. Now because it's unlimited, you can go ahead and have other people add their dice in this spot as well. Now if you ever get into a situation where there are multiple people taking this action, when you collect it in turn order. So as you can tell, the green player is first. The green player would collect his cards first, and then the blue player would pick those up. Now here's what the pioneer action does. You'll see that the symbol shows 2 cards. So a player is going to flip, or I should say the player is going to take 2 cards, and they are allowed to keep one of those cards and discard one of those cards. Now if you ever run across an event card, then you have to play those, and I'll talk about that in a second. But as you can tell, the regular action cards, they'll state action card in the dead center and they'll have a darker brown border. Whereas the event cards will have more of a yellowish orange color. So that's what an event would look like. And it'll also say event card in the middle of the card as well. But let's ignore that for a second and let's just talk about the action cards. First off, the action cards are very powerful. A lot of players who don't know much about the game or the cards will avoid the action cards because they don't know what they do, don't know what they are. And that can be a mistake because whenever you roll a 1 in another die and you say you don't need resources, some people think that that's a bad roll. Especially if I roll a 1 and a 2 or a 1 and a 3. It's actually not a bad roll because the cards are very good. Now granted, you may pull an event, but even if you pull an event, you get to keep the other card. So in this example, I've pulled the action card Dirty Deals and the action card Entrepreneur. So I would say, well, I'd rather have Entrepreneur, so I'm going to discard the Dirty Deals card, and I'm going to keep the Entrepreneur. Now, you play your action cards whenever you are collecting from an action. So at the point at which I grab these cards, I could also play the card instantly. I don't have to hold on to it. But if I want to, I can. And there are other symbols on here that I'll talk about a little bit later on in reference to certain things that will happen as far as there's lightning bolts and jail icons and there's a corruption icon. But I'll go more into detail when I hit the end of the video. But just to let you know, you have to pay attention to those icons. And those icons will always be right here. And then sometimes there are icons inside the ability box, but they're few and far between. So anyway, that's how you collect off the Pioneer action. So the next couple actions that I'd like to talk about are the 2 through 5 action. And I'm going to go a little bit more quickly through these actions so the video doesn't get too long, but it was important to kind of point out unlimited and limited actions and how the produce resource action really works, because like I said, it was one of the more complicated actions. The rest of the actions I'll try to step it up a little bit. So first out of the gate is going to be the hired hand action. Now you'll notice that this has a number in the bottom left corner, and this means that you can use two different combinations of dice or to make that result happen. So you don't have to have a 2, you can have 2 1s. You can use multiple dice to add up to the result of a number. Whereas in comparison to these actions that show a special die with, for example, 3 on each side, this means that you have to have a natural roll of a 3. You cannot take the politics actions with a 1 and a 2. You have to roll a 3 to take this over. Now there is an exception to this. You can use an engineer token, but I'll talk about that later on when I get to that action. So let's step back to the hired hand. Once you put a 2 or 2 1s on this action, you will collect a bonus die in your next turn. And this was what I was talking about where I said if you normally roll 2 dice unless you get a bonus die. Well, sometimes bonus die can happen from action cards, but for the most part you can pull it off the hired hand action. So once I collect off this action, on the very next turn I'll be rolling 3 dice. Now that you can only do that once. Once you've rolled those 3 dice and you use them, on the following turn you're back down to 2 dice. It's just a temporary way if you have some bad rolls to actually try to bypass it on your next turn. Another thing you can do is you can use the dealer action to bump into this. So for example, if I rolled a 1 and a 3, I can still take the hired hand action by placing a 3 here and then a 1 on the dealer action. That's going to plus or minus something. Same thing with putting a 1 here or the 3 on the dealer action. You're plus or minusing this die result. Now don't forget, you don't actually switch. You don't move the die to a 2. You want to make sure that you show other players that you used a special action. And in that regard, whenever you use the dealer action, like I said before, you want to mark that with a wild die token from the bank, just showing that you plus or minus the results. Moving on to the politics action, like I said, you have to have a 3 to take this action, and what it allows you to do is you can pay any one resource to gain an influence point, and that's going to allow you to move your colored disc down on the influence track. You're just gaining an influence point. Now, a lot of times players will confuse this and they'll think that they have to pay each one of these resources, when in reality you only have to pay 1. So just pay attention to what it states. It says pay any 1, and then it's just showing you the different resources as an example. And whenever you see an equal sign, that means you have to pay to receive this result. Moving on to the work crew, you have to have a 4 to take over this action, and it states you will produce resources on 2 hex types. So in this example, you would announce 2 different hex types, and then you would produce off of those. A lot of people get confused with this. They may think, am I grabbing 2 different types of resources? But in reality, what you're doing is you're producing. So in this example, I've dropped a couple cities. I've dropped a city and 3 towns on the board. If this is the only towns and city that I had, then the blue player can only say food and wood because he doesn't have a town on the ore resource. Remember, you can only produce resources off towns that you have off resources you have a town on top of or you have control over. So the blue player doesn't have any towns on ore, so he has to be forced to say food and wood. So if he produces off food and wood, he's going to get 1 food and 2 wood resource tokens. So that's pretty straightforward. Now the next example is going to be the rail baron. You have to roll a 5. There's no other way around that unless you have an engineer token, like I said before. Now you do notice that there is a little gold icon in this upper left corner here. Now what this means is it shows a symbol of 4 different people or silhouettes, and it says ×2. So basically that means that in a 4-player game, 2 people can take this action. So if the blue player comes along and puts a die here, in a 4-player game, someone else like the green player could also take it. So just make note of that in a 4-player game. Now it says 2 ore and a food equals 2 rails. So this is going to give you 2 additional rails that you can place on the board. Now whenever you build rails, town, or city, anything that deals with a territory map, you have to place these right away. You can't hold these around in your stock. And think of it as your citizens or townsfolk going out to a location and actually building the rails. They're not building the rails and storing them in a warehouse. They're going out into the countryside and actually physically building the rails. So once I take this action, I have to place these rails down right away. And that's going to allow me to gain access to different areas on the board. The next action is the builder action, and once again it is a numbered action, so it has a little number 6 there, which means you can take 1 die, you can take a 6 and place it there, or you can combine any other 2 or 3 dice. So you're just after the result. So a 1 and a 5, a 3 and a 3, or a 6 will take this over. So that's how you would take this action. Now it allows you to do 2 different things. It allows you to build a town or build a city. And like I've said before, you can never take multiple items or collect multiple things off one action. So you can't build 2 towns, you can't build a town and a city. It's just 1 item. So in this example, if I wanted to build a town, I would need 2 food and a wood token, and then I could drop a town onto the board. And like I just mentioned about the rails, if you build something, you have to place it right away on the board. So you have to be careful that you don't take an action that you don't have a position to place it down on. So in the other example, when I placed the 2 rails out to that ore hex, if I built a town, then I could go ahead and place that down right away. And the other option you can take for the builder is you can pay a gold and 4 wood and build another city. Down below that is going to be the trader action. So for a 7 and an or an 8, once again, you can do any combination of results. So you put a 1 and a 6 here, and that will allow you to take the action. It's pretty straightforward. What it allows you to do is to pay any 4 resources. They don't have to be the same. It could be 2 wood, a food, and an ore. It could be 3 ore and a food. It really doesn't matter. It's pay any 4, and you can take 1 gold, or you can pay any 4 and take any 2 resources from the bank. So this is your way to trade out. If you are having a hard time getting access to either ore, food, or wood, and you have no other way to collect those, then you might want to use the trader action. Down below that's going to be your engineer action. It also is a 7/8 action. Now what you're going to do on this is you're going to gain 2 different tokens, and you're going to go +1 in the turn order. Now sometimes players get a little bit confused about what do you mean by +1. It just means you're going to go up in the turn order. So for example, if you're in the 4th position and you go and take this, you'll only go up to the 3rd position. It's not going all the way to the top of the turn order like when you place a die in the turn order action space. Let's go ahead and talk about the tokens that you can receive from this. Now like the picture shows, you'll be able to collect a wild die token and an engineer token. Now one thing I need to mention is that these special tokens are limited. You of course have resource tokens, you have food, wood, and ore. But then you have other types of tokens like the loan, the wild die token, the engineer token, the stock token, even the trader token. Well, these other tokens are limited tokens. And they're limited because you can only have as many of these tokens or each specific token as number of cities. So the blue player only has 1 city right now, which means the blue player can only have 1 wild die token, 1 engineer token, he can only have 1 loan, he can only have 1 stock, and so on. Once the blue player builds his 2nd city, then he can have 2. So one of the advantages to dropping another city on the board is that you can collect more of these tokens. And it's very helpful, especially with the wild die tokens. Because another way for you to gain wild die tokens is whenever you roll doubles or if you roll triples when you have the third die or the bonus die. But you can't obtain the wild die token unless you can hold on to it, which means if you only have one city and you already have a wild die token and you roll doubles, you're out of luck. So let's go back to describing these tokens a little bit more. Now don't forget that the instructions for each token are on the back, so you can always refer to those. But the wild die token, as I mentioned earlier, has the ability to plus or minus a result. So in my previous example, if I really wanted the 6 action, then I could burn this wild die token and I would just mark it and put it on top of here to take the 6 action. The other ability that the wild die token has is it allows you to re-roll your dice. You can re-roll 1, 2, or 3 dice in the event you have the bonus die. So if you ever have a really bad roll and you're sitting there with a wild die token, go ahead and use it, because every time you roll doubles you're going to gain another one back, and you can also gain one off the engineer token as well. So that is the gist behind the wild die tokens. Finally, you have the engineer token, and if you remember, I was mentioning that there is a way around the natural requirements on the 3, 4, and the 5 spot. If you have a really hard time, say, rolling a 5 to build rails, then you might want to concentrate on obtaining one of these engineer tokens, because one of the abilities on the engineer is to change your die roll to anything. Now, I need to specify a single die. So if I were to roll a 2, I could burn this engineer token to physically change it to anything that I want. And in that regard, I can engineer or manipulate that die into being a 5. And that will suffice for the requirement on the natural rolls. Now, the other thing that the token allows you to do is to share an action. So let's pretend if we're playing in a 3-player game and the green player had already taken the builder action. Because it's a 3-player game, I can't place another die in here. I don't gain the benefit of this icon up in the corner that says in a 4-player game, 2 players can place in here. But what I can do is I can burn an engineered token to share this spot. So the engineer allows you to share a location. And that's it for the engineer action. The next action below that is going to be the scout action. And that's pretty straightforward. It shows a picture of 3 card faces, and that just means you draw 3 cards. So I go ahead and draw 3 cards, and if you happen to run across an event, you have to play the event, and you get to keep one of the remaining cards. And you have to put the other card that you don't keep on top of the deck. So in this example, the event would play immediately, and then I would have a decision on which card I could keep. So once again, if I were to keep the entrepreneur card, then I would be putting this remaining card back on top of the deck. And that's the distinction with the scout. You're putting the card back on top of the deck so you know what's coming up next. Now, if we were to take another example here and say we drew 3 action cards. If we drew 3 action cards and there was no events in play, then I could pick one of these, and then I could put these 2 remaining cards back on top of the deck. And I would keep Shay's Saloon. So the real benefit behind this action, and the fact that you're using a 9, which is a higher result on the dice, is that you know what cards are coming up. And that can be very helpful. It also allows you to draw 3 cards down, which gives you a lot more information about making a decision on what card you want. And finally, the last thing that you can do on this action is you can peek at one of the resource hexes. So I should say one of the unrevealed resource hexes. So in this example, if this hex was unrevealed, then I could grab this and bring it over to myself and look at it and put it back down. So I have a little bit of information. Now this isn't an or condition. You get to peek and draw your cards. And finally, we're going to look at the mayor action. It is a 10, but you'll notice right away that it has a restricted banner up at the top. Now this is basically requiring that you have a natural roll, which means you can't put a 9 on this action and then you can't use a wild die to plus or minus this up. You also cannot use an engineer to share the action with somebody else. You basically have to roll a natural 10 or the result of a 10. And then once you do that, you can take this action. So let's talk about what you actually gain from this action. You'll notice that there is an influence point here. So you will go up on the influence track by 1, and then you also get to take 1 resource from the bank. So it's a little boost. You get a little influence point and a little resources, and you also get this mayor key. Now the mayor action is a special role. I should say the key gives you a special role in the game, and these special roles have additional powers. So the mayor special role allows you to bypass the payment that's required on politics. So instead of having to pay 1 on the politics action whenever you place a 3 on it to gain an influence point, you could ignore that. You just place the 3 there and then gain the influence point. So it's a little bit cheaper for you to gain influence. So thematically it makes kind of sense that you're the mayor and you can gain access to politics a little bit cheaper. And let's go ahead and talk about some of the other actions below. So right below the mayor action is the sheriff action, and it also is a special role that you can take. Just like the mayor action, it's restricted, so you're going to have the result of a natural 10. You can't plus or minus into it, and you can't use the engineer token to either modify your die to change something or to share the action. Now, unlike the mayor action, the bonus for taking this is more in the special role than it is what's on the action. For the mayor, you gain an influence point and a free resource and the mayor key. Well, the influence point and the free resource were kind of the bonus for that action. In the sheriff action, what you're after is the special role. Now, you will gain first turn order, and that's what this little 1 corresponds to. If you look in the turn order, it's going to show you the same 1 icon in the first turn order spot. But if you claim this, it's also going to give you the sheriff token and then the sexy silver deputy die. And the power in the sheriff role, the special role, is mainly the deputy die. Now, one side effect of being the sheriff is that no one can play a jail action or ability on the sheriff. So if someone rolls, or I should say if someone draws an action card that has a jail icon on it, it will always have another icon on it that shows the sheriff symbol and a little red X through it. And that just simply means that you cannot affect the sheriff when you're doing this. So if you're stealing food by using the action card called Untended Farmland, then you cannot affect the sheriff when you're doing that. Same thing if you want to force a player to lose influence points or move them in turn order, you can't do it to the sheriff. But like I said, the real power is in the sheriff, the deputy die. So what you do with this deputy die is you replace one of your regular die. So in this example, I would normally roll 2 blue dice every turn, but I would replace one of my blue dice with the silver deputy die. Now whenever I roll this silver die, I can flip it to the bottom. So this 1 here can be flipped to a 6. And if you ever use the ability to flip the die, you have to use it by itself. And that's to prevent if someone were to have a natural 6 in their other color and they were to roll and flip this to a 6, it would be a little unfair that they could just manufacture a 12 out of that. So if you ever flip the die, To use it in another spot, you have to use it by itself. You can never combine this. So you have to watch out that you don't accidentally do that. So what this is good for is obtaining all of the natural die rolls up at the top. So the 3, the 4, the 5 can be more easily obtained because you can flip that die result around. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility when you're the sheriff. And that is basically that action. Next down from there is going to be the broker action. So if you put the result of an 11 on 2 or 3 dice, you're going to gain a stock token. Pretty straightforward. And the stock token is going to tell you what it does on the back. It basically allows you to trade it in at any time for any 3 resources or 1 gold. And a lot of people will just say, well, I'm just going to change it in for a gold. And a lot of the flexibility in that stock token is to hold off and wait to see what you need. So later on down the road, if you want to drop some more rails to continue to grow, and you've already blown your stock token for a gold, and you don't have the 2 ore, then you've kind of hosed yourself. So I've seen a lot of players just go ahead and blow that stock token right away. The versatility in it is to keep it around. Now, if you ever get into a situation where, say, you only have 1 city and you have a stock token already, and then you roll an 11 and you feel like you can't use your stock token, you're not going to lose it. All you do is, right before you claim the action, you use the stock token to, say, get your gold or your resources, and then you claim or collect the 11, the broker action, and then you get the additional stock token. So you're never in a position where you can't use it. So on to the number 12, the Tycoon action. Really straightforward. You gain a gold token and 1 rail. But that's a good bonus because you don't have to pay for or trade for the gold, and the free rail is always nice. So 9 times out of 10, if you roll a 12, you probably should take the Tycoon action. Now on the broker, it's a 5 and a 6 that you normally would get unless you have 3 dice and you've made some other combination to get the 11. Sometimes when you roll a 5 and a 6, it's nice to take the Rail Baron and the Builder action, especially in a 4-player game when there's the ability for 2 people to place on those. If you have spots to place rails and you can place another town or a city, sometimes that 5 and 6 is a lot more powerful to be used on Rail Baron and Builder. But it's just a matter of tactics. And finally, you've got the market action. And essentially, it's a really bad trade mechanism. And another bad thing about it is that it happens at the very end of the track. Now, I'm not trying to criticize the market action. It's just used for players when they're out of luck. When you're out of luck, you can go down to the market and try to find a buyer and spend all day or week down there. It's meant to be thematically a last resort. So if you need to trade, say, any 3 resources to gain 1 resource back, you can. The other ability on here says pay 1 gold to take any 3 resources. And finally, you can pay any 6 resources to take 1 gold. Now, towards the end of the game, this becomes kind of powerful because you have a lot of extra resources lying around. Especially if you have 5 or 6 towns on resources, it's not difficult at all to gain 4, 5, or 6 resources in one shot with 1 die. And that's when you need to start trading those out with the market, because the trader action, for the most part, will take 2 dice. And it has a very specific number, a 7 or an 8, that you would have to take to collect it. So towards the end of the game, the market is used quite a bit to grab gold. But you have to plan ahead for it because you have to put a die there. And that is basically the actions in the game. So let's go ahead and start talking about the character cards and the action cards in a little bit more detail. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the action cards real briefly, and basically mention some of the symbols that are on the action cards and a little bit of the timing. Now, about the action card deck in general, you'll notice that there are action cards and some of the cards have a yellowish border, and it's called event cards. All of the cards are action cards for the most part, and the reason that I've broken them off into two different distinctions is because later on down the road when expansions come out, there may be different decks. So for example, if there is a progress card deck down the road, there'll be progress cards in there, but there also will be events that have pertain to what happens to progress or new technologies. So I just wanted to make that point clear, and that's why you see the distinctions. Another reason for it is that event cards are played a little bit differently, and going on in the future, event cards will be played the same way. So it's really just introducing the players into this mechanism. So right away you're going to notice that the action cards state action card here, and the event cards are the same effect. And as I mentioned, there's some different colorations in that as well. Now, as far as timing of action cards go, unless there's a special symbol on them that specifies something different, the timing for when you can play an action card is right as you collect dice off one of your actions. So for example, if I have dice on the hired hand action, right before I pick those up and take the action, or right after I take the action and I collect off of it, that's when I have the time to play something like an action card. That's also the same time at which I mentioned you can play your character abilities. So that puts a little bit more order into the game as to the timing of things and how and when you can play these. You can also only play one action card per turn. Just like you can only use one wild die token per turn or use one engineer token per turn. And this isn't affected by city limit. Just because you have 2 cities does not mean you can play 2 action cards. You can only ever play one action card and one limited type token per phase that it's specified in. So let's talk about the symbols a little bit. Now, you've already known from the rules that if an event card comes out, it has to be played immediately, and it replaces any other event that is currently in play. You'll notice that there is a lightning bolt symbol in the lower right corner of the image, and other cards have this lightning bolt symbol as well. It just basically means that you have to play the card immediately. So if you ever run across a card that has this lightning bolt symbol on it and it's not an event card, it's just stating that if you choose to take this card, you have to play it immediately. And a lot of people that are just new to the game don't realize this, and they end up having these lightning bolt type cards in their hand. And the reason these cards exist and have that symbol is so that late in the game you're not just holding on to these things and then 2 or 3 turns in a row you're knocking down someone's influence points or you're stealing from them. It's an attempt to make the game a little bit more fair as far as the game end conditions go along. Now, some of the other symbols on these cards will be a little green circle with a sheriff badge and a red X through it. It basically means if you do a jailable action on somebody or all players, you can't affect the sheriff. So if someone has the sheriff special role, especially in this untented farmland, for example, if I choose to take the jailable action in the bottom, I can't affect that player that has the sheriff special role. On that same note, you'll notice that there's 2 options on this card. And all of these cards that have multiple options will have a question mark. Some events even have question marks for you to take a choice. It's just trying to show you can't use both options on the card, or you can't interchange them. You have to pick one. Another card symbol that you're going to run across is the corruption symbol. And it just basically means that if you choose to use this card, then you're going to go last in turn order. If you're already last in turn order, it doesn't affect you. So maybe you want to hold on to this until you get lower in the turn order, then fire it off. Sometimes corruption cards have additional penalties to them as well. Like Private Investors is one of my favorite cards. But it does have a penalty where it makes you lose an influence point and it moves you to last in the turn order. But you get a pretty hefty bonus in return for that action. Another thing that it's really nice to mention to players that haven't played the game before is that the action cards are quite powerful and sometimes can be more beneficial to you than just using the basic actions on the board. It really depends upon the situation. Of course, you're going to draw cards that don't necessarily help you in that specific game at that specific time. But overall, in general, they are pretty powerful. And the events, you're going to be drawing out the events, but you always get to keep an action card, which is nice. Now, the only other symbol that I haven't really talked about so far is the corruption symbol and the jail symbol. I just talked about the corruption symbol. So the jail symbol, you'll notice, is a red circle with bars through it, kind of like the jail space, and it shows a number on it, 1 or 2 plus. If you were to take a card that has a jail of 1, like for example Claim Jumpers, that means next turn one of your dice is going to be put in a jail. So if you normally roll 2 dice, you're only going to be rolling 1 dice on that turn. If you run across a card that has 2 plus on the jail symbol, that basically means if you have 2 or more dice, you're going to place those dice in jail. So that's just a catch-all for if you have a bonus die, you're going to lose that as well. It's, in essence, it's putting all your dice next turn onto the jail spot. And don't forget, every jailable action card or action cards that have that jail symbol are going to have the little green icon that says you can't affect the sheriff. That's just one of the benefits for being the sheriff special role. One of the questions I've had in the past is on 2 of the event cards, there is an option and then a little jail symbol at the bottom. It just basically states the event's going to come into play no matter what, but you have an option to choose when that event fires off. And in both cases, you can do a 2 plus jail, meaning all your dice are going to go into the jail spot on the next turn to steal a gold from the bank. And that is that. Now, there have been questions about jail icons in the preacher character, and sometimes there are jail icons in different positions. The preacher explicitly states that you cannot use a card that may potentially put you into jail, or a card that will positively put you in jail. So, for example, the Whispering Campaign, when you use the card, it is going to put you in jail, so the preacher can't use it. Another good example is Snake Eyes. Snake Eyes has the possibility of putting you in jail, which means that the preacher can also not use that because they could potentially go to jail. And for something like Train Robbers, the preacher still plays the event. They just cannot use the option to go to jail. Another question with the preacher card, since I happen to be on it, is can you discard an event card that has a jail symbol on it for a victory or for an influence point? And you can't, because the events come into play immediately. And one of the conditions on the preacher card is that if you control one of those cards, well, you don't actually ever control an event card. It is revealed and has to be put into a play immediately. However, something like Snake Eyes, you do actually control that card. So whether the jail symbol is in this ability box and has the potential, it's still a jail card for all intents and purposes. It can produce or cause someone to go to jail. So yes, the preacher could discard the Snake Eyes card for a victory point, right? An influence point, I'm sorry. Same thing with Dirty Deals. It doesn't matter where the jail symbol is in this regard. It's an action card that will put someone in jail, so the preacher can discard that for an influence point. And that's basically it for the action cards. This next section, I'd like to talk a little bit about the characters. And right away out of the gate, I'd like to mention that if you're playing with a lot of people that don't know the game or are not familiar with the Dice Euro or designer games in general, you probably should not use the characters, because they become more of something that the player has to remember how to use and to look at their abilities. If you have someone that's experienced with a character, they will use the ability to full effect, whereas the person who's never played the game will kind of be lost in trying to understand some of the other mechanics in the game and ignore their character altogether. So it becomes a little bit offsetting. So I do recommend that you do hold back on players new to the game playing with the characters. But once you actually have a couple games under your belt, or you're very comfortable with Euro or Dice Euros in general, by all means have a player randomly pick out a character and then use it. Now, a couple things that players have asked, and I'm going to be putting this in the FAQ, is some of the characters have an ability on the card that states for a die or for any die, and they wonder how that's used. Well, basically, you take that die and you just place it on the card, and it's almost like as if you placed it on an action on the game board, or if you had placed an any die on the market or the dealer. You are still spending that die, and you're just announcing that you're going to use an ability and place it on the card. And for that matter, players really should get into the habit of announcing until players around them are aware of their powers that they are using an ability. For example, the merchant has an ability that states that they can use the produce resources action on a 3+ versus a 4+. Well, the very first time you use that, someone's going to tell you, hey, you can't do that. You have to have a 4+. Well, if you announce I'm going to use a merchant's ability to do a 3+ here, then it quickly gets it out of the way. Unless players are already familiar with these cards, you don't have to keep on announcing what exactly you're doing. But for new players, it is very helpful. Now, one question that came up, and I already kind of mentioned this early on, and when I was talking about setup, you get the game starting bonuses and also the start game bonus box on the character card. It's not an or condition. You get both of those. So every player, when they start the game, gets one of each resource, a wild die token, a free rail, and then also whatever is inside their blue start game box. Another thing that sometimes gets confused is the timing on the abilities. You have to make sure that when you're using the ability, you're using it at the right time during the collection action. You can't just fire off an ability to obtain something when it's not necessarily your turn. So it falls in the same vein as you can only use an action card when you are using or picking up the dice from an action in the collection phase. So if I had a die on the hired hand, before or after I use that action, then I can use a card, or I can use one of the tokens like a stock token, and then I could also use an ability on my character card. So you have to be careful about the overall timing of these abilities. So that's about it for the character cards. There is a section on the back that states who, what, and why, and it's kind of a little helpful reminder, a little bit of thematics thrown in there, and also if you're going to play the character, what the benefits are. And if you want to go ahead and pick your characters out instead of randomly deciding to use them, then you can kind of read the why. There's a why section on the back of the card that states this is more of an advanced player, or this is an easy character to play with. So go ahead and refer to those. And if there's any questions on the characters themselves, refer to the FAQ that I'll be putting out here in a little bit. So that's pretty much it for the tutorial. I wanted to thank everyone for sticking around, and I apologize for the length of the tutorial. It's just having to spend the time to get through all of those rules and get them down on the video. And I suppose there's things I could have done better in this video, but I kind of wanted to hurry up and get this out there, and eventually sometime down the road I'm going to use more of a PowerPoint presentation approach, so I can actually use arrows and comments and whatnot to kind of show things and animations on the screen. But until then, go ahead and ask me any questions that you may have, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And once again, I'd like to thank everyone for supporting me on the project, and have a great day.